It's been called one of the most reproduced photographs of all time, and the image that reframed everything. On December 7th, 1972, during a trip to the moon, the crew of Apollo 17 captured the Earth, illuminated blue and white, glimmering in space. Often called the blue marble, it has become a defining symbol of NASA's space program and an icon in US and global visual culture. Now, the blue marble was not the first photograph to show the Earth as a fully rounded disk. Since the late 1960s, satellites had been beaming down whole Earth images of varying qualities. But this was the first and, as it would turn out, the last to be taken by a human. All of the astronauts on board, Gene Cernan, Ronald Evans and Harrison Schmitt, have, at different times, claimed to have been the one to have grabbed the Hasselblad camera and snapped the defining shot. NASA credits them all. Perhaps, though, the real power of this image transcends any single author or organization. It is the photograph in which so many have found connection and resonance. From environmental scientists and the environmental movement to artists, philosophers, filmmakers, technologists, and political activists, the blue marble continues to elicit fascination and critique. Now, 50 years later, as NASA launches Artemis, an endeavor promising to ultimately put the first woman on the moon, the first person of color on the moon, and eventually the first humans on Mars, images of the Earth from space have found themselves center of attention once again. In this special episode of Pop Matters, filmed and live streamed by students at the University of Portsmouth, we revisit the original, the iconic, the famed blue marble. It's the first of several events that have been supported by the US Embassy in London and the British Association of American Studies, devoted to revisiting this iconic image. Hello, and welcome to this very special live edition of Pop Matters. I'm your host, Professor Lincoln Geraghty, and I'm joined today by a group of experts with different interests in the famous photograph, the blue marble. On the sofas joining me today are Dr. Rebecca Janicker, Senior Lecturer in Film and Media at the University of Portsmouth.
Hello.
Dr. Chris Pattison, Senior Research Fellow in the Institute of Cosmology and Gravitation at the University of Portsmouth.
Hello.
Peter Kramer, Senior Research Fellow in Film at the Montfort University.
Hello.
And Dr. Jennifer Levasseur, Curator at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C.
Hi there.
Thanks all for joining us today. Now let's start with a warm-up question, get you talking. It's been described as one of the most reproduced photographs of all time. Now, from your various perspectives, film, media, science, why do you think the blue marble has received so much attention? What do you see in the blue marble? And Jennifer, I'm going to go to you.
What I see in the blue marble is really a personal story, in a sense, is that, you know, this is something that human beings actually experienced. I like to look at it as a lens of its own type, which is sort of a lens on a time when, that I can't imagine personally because I wasn't alive at the time, but that I know many people do have memories of. And to think about what those people were experiencing in that moment, to me, seeing something that unbelievable in a sense with one's own eyes, and obviously then with a camera as well, is really magical in many ways.
And never seen before, right? This is like the image.
In this format, yes. I mean, we had seen Earth going back to the Apollo 8 mission with the first time people had gone to the moon, but to see it in its entirety like this was the first time.
Excellent. Peter, what does it mean for you?
Well, I grew up in that period, and visions of the globe were everywhere. So you didn't actually need the picture, this particular picture. You could see it in movies, on television. You know, maybe not the whole Earth, maybe fractions of the Earth, but images from space weren't that unusual. So I have to say, actually, that the image didn't mean anything to me, because I spent my childhood in the late 60s, early 70s, thinking about space all the time anyway, and thinking about the Earth from space. So it's a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. Rebecca, for you?
Yeah, as someone who studies the Gothic, what the image kind of says to me is notions of the sublime. I mean, it's this awe-inspiring image that really kind of puts humanity into perspective. You know, writers back in the 18th century, artists thinking creatively about huge landscapes. You know, you have these amazing landscape paintings, and you have works of art and literature that kind of encapsulate the idea that there is something bigger than us, whether that's the elements or mountains or, you know, torrential waterfalls. And an image like this, of course, you know, really kind of encapsulates that wonderfully.
Brings it all together, yeah. And Chris, cosmologist, what does it mean for you?
I think it's a really interesting photo that combines the awesomeness of the science, like the engineering and the science that let us take that photo. You know, this is pretty much the first time that a human took a photo of the entire disk of the Earth. So it's sort of the combination of the awesome technology and then the inspiringness of, I don't think that's a word, but the awe-inspiring photo that it is. And it sort of combines the hugeness of the globe, and like every human alive except for 3 is in that photo, and yet it still looks lonely and hanging in space, sort of in the vastness, which I think is a really cool juxtaposition to get out of that.
Yeah, I've not thought of it like that. There are 3 other people that aren't in the picture. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. And we'll dive deep into the sort of cultural resonance behind this image. I'll start with specific questions, and I'll turn to Rebecca first, who's just edited a book called The Scientist in Popular Culture and has appeared in our last Pop Matters show about that topic. So I'll ask you first, what do you think the Blue Marble's place is in the visualization of science and pop culture?
Yeah, well, where my mind goes with this is thinking about, I started by talking about the Gothic, but thinking about science fiction, thinking about Gothic and my area of interest, which is horror, what the image says, and kind of picking up on, you know, what Chris has just been talking about, the idea of the Earth juxtaposed with the vastness of space, really fascinating. So going back about 100 years or so, writers of science fiction like H.P. Lovecraft were very grabbed by astronomy. You know, Lovecraft was interested in science and interested in what we could learn from disciplines like astronomy about the world. And of course, at that point, you know, kind of 20s and 30s, things were starting to find their feet compared with the clarity of this image here. And writers associated with cosmicism really bring home that sense of the hugeness of space, the tiny beauty and vulnerability of the Earth. And for me, there's kind of 2 sides to the coin, really. There's the awe and the wonder, but also potentially the awe and the fear. And you can look at the fantastic image of the Earth itself, but you can also look at the vast, unknown, perhaps unknowable, although increasingly things changing, depths of space beyond. And that really works powerfully on the imagination, I think.
So almost what's not in shot is the scariest thing.
Potentially, or what
What's
could be that we can't grasp.
To swallow it up.
Yeah, that kind of thing, yeah.
That's interesting. You know, we talked about the positivity, but the sort of the literal darkness of what's not being sort of in frame or taken a picture of. Now, Peter, you've written a book too, examining 2001, A Space Odyssey, discussing the significance of that film in terms of, again, visualizing space, the vast darkness and quiet and silence. How would you describe images of Earth used in that film, but also considering other famous images such as Earthrise, released in the same year?
Well, that's what I'm coming back to, that this is, I mean, I didn't see 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, I only saw it in the late 70s, but I saw other things which were imagining space travel and all of that. And of course, in a sense, it's unimaginable today to think that the opening sequence of 2001, where the Earth rises above the moon and then the sun above the Earth, that image was taken before Blue Marble and before Earthrise. Yeah. This was all, and of course, there's nothing surprising about that. The studio logo for Universal Studios had been a globe since about 1912, 1913. And in actual fact, a lot of studios, film studios, used globe-like imagery or heavenly imagery, looking down from the heavens to a huge mountain, as in Paramount. So for me, this picture is a culmination. As a historian, when I now look back, it's a culmination. It's not a starting point, it's a culmination. And the film 2001, in retrospect, for me now that I've done all this research on it, that is a starting point. So for me, it's not neither Earthrise nor The Blue Marble. It's 2001: A Space Odyssey, because as a film historian, I can see the traces of that film in virtually every science fiction blockbuster made ever since. And you may know that last week the results of the latest Sight and Sound poll of international critical opinion came out. 2001 is at number 6, but the directors poll, where filmmakers, hundreds of filmmakers from around the world are asked about their favorite films, 2001 is on top. So Star Wars, Close Encounters, Gravity, Contact, all these movies, right up to Avatar, they come right out of that movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that's acknowledged. This is not something where you just compare the films. The filmmakers have said as much. So, and not the least appeal of the film is this fantastic experience of being in space. Because if you saw the film in its original version, I once saw it on a curved IMAX screen, Cinerama screen. I'm tempted to say IMAX, but before IMAX there was Cinerama. I saw it on a curved IMAX screen, and you really feel disoriented when you sit close to the screen, because the film plays with, being, without gravity, losing the sense of up and down. The film plays with that. If you see that on a curved screen, you really experience it. So the film is a space trip. It puts you into space. And I think that's the experience that for many people was arguably more important than watching this picture, or even watching the moon landing. Yeah.
I'm a little disappointed Battery's Not Included is nowhere in that top 10. I'll have a word with Sight and Sound later, but we might come back to that. Now, Jennifer, your book, Through Astronauts' Eyes, explores astronaut photography, and we really are talking about multiple images here, with Blue Marble as one of the most iconic. What do you think is the photograph's semiotic power, and how is it related to this ongoing resonance?
Well, it is very symbolic. I mean, it captures so many things. I think the idea of it, capturing all of humanity yet excluding everything around us is a really interesting one. And the astronauts themselves, which is really, they're sort of the core of my story. They're almost not even the storytellers. They're creating this visual story for us, but they're pilots, they're engineers, they're people who are trained to do this work, and they're not creating a narrative in the form of a filmmaker's narrative about space travel, but yet they are. And so we see them as surrogates for what it is we want to understand, which I think is a really great point that Peter made about this, that what we really wanted was the experience. And as a museum curator, when I interact with the public in particular, that is quite clearly what young people want to understand about space, is the experience. And so when I often talk about the image, and I usually call it the whole Earth image, because it is the whole entirety of the Earth, that's sort of its more original name, it is to describe the process, and it's a little bit easier with something like Earthrise because there's another object in the image to be able to orient things, but to describe what it was like to be an astronaut in that moment is very difficult, because this image could have been taken from any angle. You could be upside down, sideways, in so many different orientations, because that's how it works in space. There's no up or down. And so to kind of tell this story is incredibly complicated without something else to help you with that. I often like to not only talk about this, but talk about one often called The Loneliest Man, which is an image taken by Michael Collins during Apollo 11, where he is the only human in all of history not in the frame of the one image. So it's not just 3, it's 1. And so it's a very powerful, sort of opportunity to think about the astronaut as literally our lens on this entire landscape and spacescape, if you wanted to call it that, to be able to see the sort of entirety of everything in that view. And it becomes a little bit more simple to, I think, when you have those little things. It makes this a much more scary image as well. I agree that it's kind of has that tone of being very intimidating. That this is the only place we have. And so what do we do with that? And so I think it challenges us to think about, I think what we'll talk about maybe is a little bit like sort of looking forward, you know, if this is this fragile orb in space, as the astronauts described it, what else is there? And right in that image, all that you the only other thing you see is blackness and darkness, and it's
nothing else
very,
in frame.
It's very intimidating.
Yeah, and just to pick up your point on the astronaut, you know, they're not trained photographers; they're scientists, pilots, you know, military men. So to actually capture an image like that is often seen as a sort of perfect picture.
It is.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what'll be really interesting is coming up here just in the next few years when we have someone else, another human, go through this same process. Hopefully within the next year or two, we'll have a different person. And so you mentioned these are all military men. What will it be like for other people to feel, of other cultures, backgrounds, genders, and everything, to feel more connected with that story? I think that moment will be potentially have more of an impact than even this image could, because there's a different opportunity to connect with it.
Yeah, and life has moved on. It's a different planet, of
absolutely,
course. Brilliant. Thank you, Jennifer. And Chris, looking at it as a cosmologist, are there particular aspects of the blue marble that interest you and your field? And does that have an impact on the way you do your research and communicate that research to others?
Oh, that's a good question, yeah. I mean, looking at the picture, there are some fascinating things. Like you can see a big cyclone in the top right, sort of in the Indian Ocean, which is just something that you have to look at it for a long time to notice. And like this is the first time we would have seen the southern polar ice caps from space. So it's cool because, well, to me at least, because this is kind of the only place we can see those things. Like we now know, we didn't at the time, but we now know there's thousands of other planets around other stars. But we are so far away and they're so small that we can't see that sort of detail. And even on the planets in our solar system, they look completely different. And there is that uniqueness of, obviously, we live on this planet, but we can't see anything like this wherever we point a telescope. So this really is the one lens onto the Earth and the people that we have here. And I think that's really special. I think that's what impresses me most about it, is the uniqueness, and sort of we have the beauty of what we have, but then it's so easy to lose that beauty as well. I think, you know, the astronauts could have, you know, covered the entire Earth with their thumb, and it makes it look very fragile.
The
right?
ultimate power, just to blot us all out. And you mentioned telescopes there. So, you know, this is a handheld camera compared to those multi-billion-dollar telescopes. And you're saying this is an image that captures more detail, perhaps, or a different sort of detail?
Yeah, I mean, those telescopes are incredible at capturing detail, but it's just a completely different scale.
Right.
Like, the Earth is you know, it's relatively big compared to us, and they were relatively far away. But when you think about the vastness of what those billion-dollar telescopes are looking for, they're light years and light years away and light years across. But really here, the proximity, it really helps you out, even with a handheld camera. Like, this was developed by hand in Texas, I think, this photo. That shows you how easy it was to take, and well, you know, once you had the picture, it was easy to do. Whereas with a big telescope, you have a lot of processing to get an image that would look like this.
Yeah, and international partnerships.
Absolutely, they go around the world, and everyone has a go at it. And I guess to touch on the other part of your question, which was, does things like this in visual culture impact how we do science? Yeah, I think it might be hard to argue that you could convince maybe JWST to point at something because it looked like something in pop culture. But I think the important thing that pop culture does is inspire scientists. There's a whole generation of scientists that saw this picture, or, you know, saw the Apollo landings in general, and because of that went into science, and then will have done incredible research. And I mean, maybe you could convince a grant panel to give you some money because something looks like Star Wars. Like, Saturn has a moon that looks like the Death Star, and I bet that's disproportionately more photographed than the rest of those moons that no one knows about.
Darth Vader could be there right now,
exactly,
and we wouldn't know.
I mean, there is a part of it that's, you know, people hand out money, and connecting people with culture that they're aware of might help you get a funding proposal through and do interesting things. But I think it's also important, like you say, when we communicate research, if we can connect it back to sci-fi or things in the public lens, then it's much easier to say, oh, we discovered a planet that might be like Tatooine, than it is to say we saw another rocky thing in space. Like, one of those is a much more interesting story that people want to learn about.
And it plants that image in the head.
Exactly.
They're familiar with Tatooine, so they get that image straight away.
Absolutely. So I think that's an important connection that you can make as well.
Excellent. That's brilliant. So a question for the panel, and by all means chip in. NASA are starting to send back images from Earth, to Earth from Artemis. Do you think they'll have the same impact as 1972?
It's something that I've thought quite a bit about. And, you know, it's important to remember that this particular image is not only one of a series. There were a handful, maybe 5, 6 in the series, the sequence that was done at the time. So one particular frame was picked out. That really is the only opportunity we had for just about 30 years. So any opportunity to talk about the Earth in those years, intervening years, it's about this.
Yeah.
And it has that impact, I think, again, because it has to do with the people involved. There are people who can tell stories about this. So there is a sort of textual component to this. There's a verbal component. Astronauts go on television and talk about it. They do interviews, and so there's all of this wrapped up. And for the last 20 years, since we were able to reproduce it with machines, robots that go out, fly out at a distance and can then do this and reproduce this digitally, it's wonderful. Artemis 1 is also robotically controlled. It's got a slew of cameras on board, something like 16 cameras that can point in different directions. We can see it we can see the vehicle with the Earth and the Moon in the background. But there's no person that could reproduce those. There happens to be a mannequin inside, and that's lovely, but it's not a robotically controlled thing that could hold up the camera. There is something about the experience of that moment, and I think we all know that experience now. I just toured Portsmouth today. I could hold up my cell phone and take pictures of whatever I wanted. We relate to that experience, that actual physical experience in a way, and that's what people want to understand about it. So I think the next Artemis mission will be the moment when, depending on if it's timed right, because of course this takes timing, this particular moment when the Earth is full takes some calculations if that's how they decide to time it. This could be recreated by a person. And I think that'll be the moment when it really has meaning to people in a different way. I think these images we're seeing from Artemis 1 are beautiful. They're amazing. They're incredibly detailed, very high resolution. They're just not, there's not really a feeling of a story there. There's nothing, you know, we can't put ourselves in the shoes of that mannequin or that spacecraft because we are not robot. You know, like we don't have that capability. But if that was an actual person, that'll be when things change.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying about the agency, the person behind the camera. That's the story that we're also interested in. Does that mannequin have a name up there in space?
I believe it does, and I don't remember. It's a female name.
The commander is called something like Munikin Campos, I think. And there's a couple of other torsos. I don't know if they have names.
A couple of other
Because it's a mannequin that's gone to the moon.
Well, sure, you know.
Picking up on Jennifer's point, even Stuart Brand, who claims to have been responsible for this picture being taken, completely misremembers the story. He launched a campaign in '66, why haven't we seen a full picture of the Earth? And NASA released a picture in '67, which was taken by robots, as it were. And that picture he put on the first issue of the whole Earth catalog. But he completely misremembers that and thinks it's that picture, which comes from '72, which is actually when the whole Earth catalog basically shut down its regular publication. So, but I think it has to do with what you say. It's a person behind this. Can I say two other things?
Yeah, go for it.
This actually has more black around the planet than most of the versions of this picture.
Right.
The original picture, actually, the negative is like this, with the Earth down here. But also, so the original picture that was published, I think, didn't have blackness. It had a little bit of black corners up there and on the sides. Secondly, there's virtually no green on this planet. What you have is white, blue, and gray, reddish brown. So basically what it looks like, ice, ocean, desert. There's no life on this planet. You know, if you know about atmospheric science, you can probably speculate, or you know, if you're a Gaian scientist, you can probably reconstruct why there is water on the planet and why there are clouds. That has something to do with life on the planet. But if you don't have that, that's a lifeless planet. The word blue marble is the exact opposite of fragility, being alive, any of those things. So once this becomes known as blue marble, it's the exact opposite of what everyone says this picture represents. And that's for me a puzzle. How can one claim this picture is about the fragility of Earth, the aliveness of Earth and all of those things, the blackness of space? Because it isn't. It's the exact opposite. And that's something for me, that's a puzzle. How does this happen? Now, obviously, there are good reasons for this, but I don't think they're very straightforward, those reasons. I think they're very complicated, and they have a lot to do with what the astronauts talked about, or what other commentators talked about, not about the image itself necessarily.
What we bring to the picture.
And what was brought for us to the picture from the people who commented on it. One last point, when we did, Oliver and I did a database search, archive search on when you will talk more about this, but we found the first reference to blue marble in 1974 in a newspaper article about a television children's program called The Big Blue Marble, which starts with not this picture, but a mock-up of that picture, and it has children playing with blue marbles. And it's not about the fragility of Earth, it's about the unity of Earth. The whole program is about children in one country, mostly America, learning about children in other countries. There was a pen pal program where you could get in touch with others. It ran for it was a public service broadcasting. So that's a wholly different context. It's about unity, not fragility. It's stability as well, I guess. You know, if it's a blue marble, there's hardly anything as stable as a blue marble. I mean, that will take a lot of effort to break a blue marble. So I think there is a lot going on in the picture itself, in the way it's talked about, and the way it was labeled. Whole Earth being the other label.
I think
go for it.
I mean, I wasn't around when this picture was taken or when any of these programs would have aired, but I think for me, the name blue marble still instills some fragility in it, because a marble is tiny and we're big, right? So when you have a marble in your hand, you feel like it's quite a fragile thing. It's made of glass. You can throw it, you can smash it, you can do whatever. And that feels fragile to me, even though, like, I know a marble is very hard, right? But you can spin it around.
You can turn it around.
But that feels very chaotic, and that's not what we would want for the global.
Archimedes, give me a lever and a place to stand on, and I will move the Earth. So that blue marble you held in your hand, that's the man, the male scientist who is in charge. Yeah, this is not the Earth being subject to universal forces. This is a fantasy about a man being in control. So I think that's what the picture ties into as well. It's this male hubris about controlling everything.
When you mentioned kids playing with marbles to start off the show about the blue marble, it reminds me of at least two scenes, one in Simpsons and one in Men in Black, where everything pans out and we find out the universe is a bunch of aliens playing with the Earth as a marble, right? And that reminds me,
very good one.
And that reminds me of the horror, the idea of like there's someone out there that could just ping us away, and it brings me back to this cosmicism of, you know, we're on the edge, and one big wrathful God can go and wipe that out.
I think if you put the image in a different sort of context, and I think what's coming out of the conversation is, you know, in many ways it depends on who's looking at it, for what purpose are they looking at it, in what context. It might be education, it might be different kinds of science, it might be pop cultural. And going back to when I was talking about cosmicism earlier, some of the ideas there that are kind of coming through really suggest something about how we kind of see ourselves in an image like this. And the idea of hubris is really interesting. I mean, you know, part of what writers were nudging at with that cosmic perspective was that sense of the unknowable and the unknown, and the idea that science is, you know, giving us insight into things. A lot of that fiction going back about a century on the cusp of many of these discoveries, you know, pre-moon landing, science is wonderful and it's amazing and there are all these discoveries and then, yeah, there's this potentially illusion of control, but perhaps it is an illusion and perhaps we may discover it's a very kind of science fiction-y dark view or of certain kind of science fiction, but maybe we are on the cusp of discovering things that we might not be that comfortable about knowing. And yeah, it's been played for laughs and it makes us think about these things. And again, going back, you know, sort of into war years, people moving away a little bit from a more traditional religious perspective into a more secular worldview, started to think perhaps less about the earth is wonderful and beautiful and distinctive, and that's because it was created by a benevolent deity. Perhaps it is beautiful and wonderful, but it's not because of a benevolent deity, it's because of other things, and maybe we don't want to know about those things.
Sheer luck.
And then we're trying, yes, you know, this Goldilocks planet is, you know, fantastic, but maybe as, you know, the 20th century wears on, we need to be more careful, and knowledge can mean a different kind of power, perhaps. Yeah.
And clearly, as an image, as a photograph, it has created all these different interpretations. It's fascinating. Historical, looking in terms of science, looking in terms of, you know, maybe we shouldn't look behind, you know, what's behind the Earth in case it, you know, comes back to bite us on the ass. Why is photography in space so important? And you mentioned astronauts going up there and all these different photos taken. Why is that so important part of the mission?
Well, it's one of the best ways. I mean, and I think this is true. It's been true for as long as the camera has been a tool to depict other places. It's the opportunity for those who can't or don't want to go someplace, aren't capable of going someplace, to sort of have that moment of connection with that place. And so I've explored a little bit about the idea of just sort of exploring with a camera, you know, taking cameras places that are otherwise unreachable almost by most people, especially at times when travel was much more complicated. So a primary example would be going to Antarctica on some of the voyages of the early 20th century. You know, taking these huge sailing vessels down to these places with a large crew. There would be one photographer on board who could then depict that voyage, depict the crew, depict that location. And those became the ways in which you informed others about that experience. And, you know, some component of what those voyagers were doing, those explorers were doing, was science. They were bringing information back, and these as bits of information about that place is valuable, and it informs sort of basically what happens with this image as well, which is oftentimes it's used symbolically as the beginning, even though it's not really a beginning. It's a bit of an end. It's also a beginning for something else, which is it's seen as an opportunity to think about the close-up. Let's go zoom back in to these features. Let's not look at them as so far away and indistinct. Let's zoom back in. And so what happened after 1972? We started orbiting the Earth again. We started taking photographs at closer range with higher powerful lenses where we could see the things that we had done to the Earth, what we were doing, the development of cities, settlements across the globe, and you can see the changes much more easily when you look close up. And I think this then begins a sort of unexpected journey for photography as a tool, is that we can have these views with electronic robotic voyagers that go out 100,000 miles away or whatever it might be. But what is more valuable in some respects is the opportunity to look closer and to see those things that really do have an impact. And so that environmental component is part of that. You know, the human development, human impact on the Earth is much more apparent when you get closer. And so the space station for the last 22 years, we've had that capability of looking down, not we as individuals, but we as sort of having surrogates who are astronauts who are up there can tell us those stories. I like the idea of looking at the cyclone there because weather events are one of the most commonly depicted things. As soon as there's a weather event, you know, I think the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were also another moment. When there is an event that is visible from space, we not only want a picture of it, we want an interpretation of it. We want someone's point of view. So I see this as a different kind of starting point for a different moment. And it really, I think that's sort of the underrated story in a sense, is that we decided to stay close to Earth, and we've done it for now decades, where we can look down and people can look down anytime and tell us a story about what they see.
Like you're saying, a trip to the moon actually starts our focus back on Earth. Yeah.
Most definitely.
I mean, maybe just another thing. This picture does tell a story, and it's the story of humanity starting out under those clouds, I guess, where there might be some green. That's where humanity started. Asia, where most people live, have always lived, is not on this picture. It's just a tiny little bit at the edge on the right. The West is not at all there at all. So what we have is the starting point of humanity in Africa, and probably under that cloud there. And then we have one of the first, maybe the first human civilization in the Middle East. So it does tell a story, but that's eerie for me, because he couldn't plan this.
Yeah.
And the other pictures, I think, I have to look at them again in the series, whether they actually show different aspects of the Earth.
No.
So maybe it was just coincidence.
It was coincidence, and what I find interesting is that in 2015, when the Discover satellite was first able to give us really a whole Earth again, and it continues to do this, and it can take images throughout the year and compile these strips of images basically to give us an image. I remember there being, I don't want to say a controversy, but some concern that since this image showed Africa and parts of the Asian continent, what we really should be showing next is North America, because I know we need to show the origins of all of these capabilities, which is kind of ludicrous in a way.
Florida.
This is still the same planet. It shouldn't, and this was just sort of, I think there's a misunderstanding that maybe the Apollo 17 astronauts, if they just waited a little longer, they could have seen another part. That's not really how it works.
Ready for the best shot.
Yeah, that's not really how the photography works. They take these images as they have time, and this is what was there for them to see, and it's not, there's no intention behind showing, although it's true. This is the sort of origins of humanity. Yeah, it does make for a lovely story. But that's, it's more circumstances than anything. Yes. But of course, on the flip side of that, decades later, well, we really should be showing, the Western cultures or some nonsense like that. And it's, it has to do with, the actual orientation of the Earth, the tilt of the Earth at a certain time of year. That's just how the mechanics work.
There's science involved.
Yes.
As you said, calculations to, reach that particular moment, and that's how it happened to be. You can't wait. So photography is important, and you've talked about that sort of resonance. And thinking forward, we mentioned Artemis and images that we're coming back now. I would like to get your thoughts on what a future sort of similar image might be that would capture our imagination. Like we've talked about 50 years of this image capturing our imagination. What could the next image from space look like that would capture the Earth? And you talked about sort of expensive telescopes. Do we have anything like that now, Chris, or are we still waiting?
I think we're still waiting. I think, as we've said, the Artemis missions with people will give us perspectives that are very interesting. Not just a white man in space taking a picture looking back, but perhaps a more varied crew of astronauts will help a lot more people to relate to this sort of thing. And I just think for inspiring the next generation of astronauts and scientists, it's very important, right? If we send someone to the moon and we don't have any pictures of it, it's hard to talk about, it's hard to inspire people. We probably wouldn't be talking about it so much in 50 years' time if it was just the word of mouth of the people that went there.
Yeah.
But in terms of what the next version or what the next image is that could be like this, I know since JWST is doing so well, people want a full Earth in infrared, which would be interesting, but perhaps harder to relate to because we can't see in those wavelengths of light. So it'll just be sort of maybe a sort of heat map, maybe a sort of certain types of emission, but it would be interesting but difficult. And I think maybe when we have a sustained presence on the moon, a shot looking back at the moon of that will be very inspiring, because that will truly be when we're the start of the next chapter, living or having a sustained presence somewhere other than Earth. That will be a huge, huge milestone. And looking back at what we've achieved, especially if the Earth is in the background of that shot, that will be
one step beyond.
Incredible, absolutely.
Actually, that's one of the posters for 2001: A Space Odyssey. people going about their business on a moon station and the Earth in the background. But Carl Sagan proposed an alternative, the pale blue dot. Voyager being, I think, already having left the solar system or being about to, and there's this tiny, it's just a pixel.
Yeah.
And he said, because that's about humility. That can still be Archimedes, you know, I can manipulate this. But I think the pale blue dot picture, but of course it's not an attractive picture because, you know, you see somewhere, you see this tiny little blue pixel.
It's a smudge on the screen.
Exactly. But that's the humility, I think, that he wants to get at.
Yeah. The pale blue dot for me is one that the longer you look at it and the longer you think about it, the more impactful it becomes. Whereas something like this straight away sort of hits you and you go, wow, we're hanging there, it's black, it's blue, it's incredible. I think that's the difference to me.
That's true.
Do you think the next picture will maybe see some of those horrors you were talking about, Rebecca? Do we want to see those horrors? Because you were talking about infrared or heat maps, because the heat map would show us that we're burning this planet alive, in a sense, wouldn't it? And we're ruining it very quickly. What images do you think are coming our way?
I suppose one of the most obvious things that would be impactful is maybe not that far from home, and that would be something that's really brings home, in that very literal sense, environmental concerns, probably. I mean, part of the allure of the science fiction, I think, is it's often about, you know, what might be on the horizon, what we don't know yet. So that's a tricky one, and I think that will always be a possibility. And the idea of the pale blue dot, I think, kind of plays into that. You know, it's about context and it's about understanding a place within the universe, which may, you know, make us trepidatious and may make us excited. But I think, you know, images are going to play a part in that. So I think there's a number of things that might make an impact, and it'd be exciting to see what happens, because we've already had images from the JWST, haven't we, that have been hugely striking and amazing. So sometimes it's what's, you know, the fabric of the image, the technology, and sometimes it's what we actually see or don't see.
I think, if we ever got an image like this of an exoplanet that looked similar as well, that would change everyone's worldview. Right? At the moment, this is the center of our universe in some sense, because we are all here. And if we see a planet that looks like this, but isn't us, that will change everything, I think.
I'm thinking Cybermen, Mondas, our twin planet. Any Doctor Who fans out there? Just beyond the moon is our twin planet.
Exactly. But if we ever saw that, it would be...
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. You create these images. Are you keeping anything from us? Are there actual pictures that we should be worried about?
Not that I'm aware of. Certainly not.
But there's one more point to make, because it's not the whole Earth. It's one half of it. And one of the NASA pictures was the whole Earth. And it doesn't look good, because it just, you don't know what it is. It is the whole Earth. So that's another of those little twists. The picture seems simple, but the more you talk and think about it, the stranger it gets. So it has the immediate impact, but there's a strangeness behind it.
Well, that's the difficulty of reproducing something like this, and why it wasn't done for 30 years was, you know, in the International Space Station, you can take snippets of the Earth, but if you stitch them together, you don't get something that looks like this, because the clouds are inconsistent, the lighting's inconsistent.
It takes too long to do.
It takes too long to do. But it just wouldn't look like one Earth. It would look like a bunch of stitched together bits of Earth. And
like that whole Earth, the real whole Earth picture looks stitched together. It doesn't look like anything.
It will do,
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think what might actually be interesting, and this has been attempted in those small snippets through the past, not long after when the Skylab astronauts were orbiting the Earth, they did a number of visual photography studies of different parts. Owen Garriott in particular did sort of very detailed photography with just sort of the same camera that, you know, essentially that took this. And then when his son went to space, he tried to repeat that. And of course, there's something like 40 years plus in between those opportunities. So I think similar to that kind of a project where you've got decades in between, what would be really potentially interesting is to have this almost exact view reproduced and put them side by side to be able to see what has changed, if it's visible. Because there is that sort of, it feels, you know, very indistinct, and the perspective here is very distant, and it feels, you know, almost impersonal, very impersonal, in fact. But to look at that same space and to see differences could potentially have some real, there could be some real power behind something like that. But at the same time, I mean, we have had the capability to look down on Earth and to see the changes, and that seemingly hasn't really moved us in the right, I mean, we're moving, and many of us are moving in that direction, but not to a point where it really feels like we're turning a corner. Maybe something like that could have some real power to motivate people to do something, because it is a significant moment in our history. We need the next most significant moment that really energizes people to do some significant work. And you know, obviously there are people around the world doing those kinds of things on the surface. How can space also help us? I think that's something NASA does think quite a bit about, is using space not only to learn about being in space, but also to have an impact on Earth. That image could potentially do something like that.
So we're waiting for that next image from Artemis, perhaps.
But there has been this art installation of the globe, and I think it tries to be photographic rather than like these cartographic globes, which have countries on them. I saw it, but I can't remember it. I think it's more or less modeled on a picture like this. And it's still touring the country. It has been touring for several years now. You can see it in cathedrals, often, interestingly.
Back to God again.
And you walk around. And it is quite, especially, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but especially in the cathedral, it is an eerie experience to actually walk around the whole Earth. And look at it. It does make an impact. I don't know who actually generated this particular project, but I thought that was an interesting one to make this 1972 experience come alive again.
And across the next few days, this being the first sort of event in a sort of event talking about the sort of impact of the blue marble image, an event called The Whole Earth here at the University of Portsmouth, we have artists and performers sort of integrating and exploring the visual and playing with this image and seeing what they can get out of it. So I think you're right to bring
one
that
of the
connection.
artworks is really terrifying.
Back to the terrifying again.
No,
isn't it?
but it is extraordinary. Because it's photocopying. It's not exactly that image, but it's slightly differently laid out. It's photocopying it again and again and again, but also letting the paper crumble a little bit. You know what it looks like at the end? A mushroom cloud.
I think that's Dan McCabe's work, isn't it? Check out the Whole Earth website, which is attached to this event, where you can see a lot of these artist explorations of the image. And again, all our sort of bios are up there, and more information you can get to find out a bit more about the blue Earth. But for now, I think it's been an excellent conversation. It's gone from the sublime to the scary. We've talked about it in terms of narrative. We've talked about it in terms of the story, the astronaut's story. And I think this is an excellent way to kick off the next few days. So I want to take this time to say thank you all. My thanks go to Rebecca Janicker.
Thank you.
Chris Pattison.
Thanks for having me.
Peter Kramer.
Thank you.
And Jennifer Levasseur.
Thank you.
We've been discussing the blue marble 50 years on, because pop matters. It's been called